From downtown Decatur, it's the Faber Files. Hello, I'm your host, Bill Faber. Because democracy demands debate, we present this program of public interest and issues. Programmed to discuss issues that are important and relevant to our community. Nowhere else on broadcast TV do you see extensive interviews with peoples and leaders in our community. This evening's guest is Mike Matejka from the Trade and Labor's Assembly out of Bloomington, Illinois. Mike is very much involved in the production of a newspaper called the Union News, and he's very steeped in labor history and workers' issues. This is a very topical issue for our community here in Decatur. Mike, welcome to our show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
You're with the Trade and Labor's Assembly.
Well, I actually work for the Labor's Union, and I'm our Governmental Affairs Director for the Labor's District Council out of Peoria that covers northern, central Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. So I get to drive around a lot.
And a focus of yours is the Union News, which is a publication.
Right.
Tell us about the Union News, Mike.
Well, it's something I've been doing. This May is 35 years.
35 years.
Of a labor newspaper that goes out monthly to union members in the Bloomington, Normal, Livingston County area, and just tries to keep people informed on current issues, what's going on, and particularly what's going on in economics and going on in the labor movement.
Why is that publication important to your members?
We get news from so many different sources, and I think for the average working person, the news is not being oriented toward their lives and their realities. And we hear economics as a stock market up, as a stock market down.
Yes.
Is Main Street up or Main Street down? That should be the question we should be asking. And so people need information on their rights, on what's available to them, and also what are the things operating out there economically that are going to impact their future and their livelihood.
Yeah. You know, in our public library here in Decatur, which is just an excellent facility and an excellent service for our community, when I review the stacks of the periodicals, years ago, there used to be labor notes.
Right.
Today, when you scan the periodical section at our Decatur Public Library, there is no publication devoted to worker issues. None. We have plenty devoted toward economic issues, investing, banks, money, corporate ink, but nothing for the workers. What do you think about that? Why isn't Labor Notes and why isn't Union News on our periodical shelf here in Decatur?
And there was a time period when Decatur had a labor paper. And almost every city in Illinois had one, in many cities all over the country. And I think part of it became just economics, as unions had to be more careful with how they spent their money. Oftentimes that was one of the things that went away. But at the same time, I think what we need to do is do what you're doing here, get out on TV, get on Facebook, get in on the internet, and get information out there. Because I think it's very important how issues are framed. And once people have a perspective that respects their rights and respects their livelihood, people will know what to do with that information. But we have to find mediums to get that to them.
Sure. Democracy demands information.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
You know, a few months ago, I was sitting around a dinner table with my father and some of his friends, and they're all business guys, now retired and very successful. And we were having a discussion, and my father's friends were kind of taking pot shots at the union workers and how it was disruptive to their business. And so I raised the point during the conversation that, I understand that you're critical of the unions, but, they're only like 4 or 7% of the workforce in the United States. And these business guys were not aware that the labor unions had been so diluted.
Right. Yeah, and I think part of this too, and when you talk to people like that, the old tradition that a rising tide lifts all boats is, I think, something our current economics has forgotten. We really are becoming a dual-class society with some people that are doing very, very well, but average people who are struggling to get by. And it's amazing to me as we go through, let's say, the minimum wage debate right now, that just the idea that you can work full-time and live below the poverty level is to me so un-American. That the American promise is you work, you put your time in, and you do things to good for the country and good for the economy, and you'll be rewarded. And for the last 20, 30 years, that lesson has been forgotten. And part of the instrument of bringing that real for people was an active union movement that said we have to lift the tide for everybody. And for that business person, if you want customers, if you want consumers, people can't just live off a credit card. You know, you got to pay people decently, and they got to have benefits. And then that rising economy will benefit that business person too.
Yes. You know, my father was the beneficiary of a very important government program after World War II. He was a naval pilot. He came back and took advantage of the GI Bill. Went to college. Without the GI Bill, there was no college for Dad.
Yeah. No, and I'm a graduate at Illinois State University. And when I go, I speak frequently on the campus. And when I go, I tell students, and they look shocked when I say this, I said, I went to Illinois State University for free. They're like, how'd you do that? I said, well, there was a time in Illinois we had an Illinois State scholarship, and if you came from a certain income level, and if you could keep a B average, you had to have your room and board and buy your own books, but your tuition was paid for. And that was an investment, just like the GI Bill was. That's an investment in the country's future.
Yes. So when you got your diploma and walked off the stage, you walked off with no debt.
Exactly.
Today, we understand that the average student loan debt of our graduates is $30,000.
Yeah. And I think we forget economically, you know, again, that's an economic burden. And if I'm that young person coming out of college with $30,000 or more in debt, when am I going to be able to buy my first home?
Right.
When am I going to be able to reinvest in the economy as an active participant? If I've spent till I'm 35 or 40 paying off student loans, when do I get to put some money back in that bank's account in terms of a mortgage and home ownership or starting a business or those kind of things?
Or can I afford to get married to the woman I love? Can we afford to have children or 2 children? How can we with this debt hanging over our heads?
Yeah. No, those are very, and again, those are, I think we sometimes forget the long-term consequences of what those investments can mean for the country.
Yes. Those kids are the future of our country.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I mean, I think if, again, education today is going to rewards tomorrow, and it's rewards not just for the individual, but for the nation as a whole in a competitive global environment. That business wants educated people.
Educated people.
Because that's how they're going to thrive.
Sure. Isn't it really like shooting ourselves in the foot to put up these roadblocks and barriers for our youth as they try to move forward with our economy?
Yeah. No, I mean, it is. When you, and I think, again, not being a business person, but so much business now is oriented toward the stock market, toward the next quarter's return, and what can I show to raise or lower the price of stock, and rather than where's this company in this country going to be in 5 years? Where are we going to be in 10 years? Where are we going to be in 20 years? And do we have the economic foundation where we can continue to grow and be viable?
And be viable, right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a core issue for our country, is the education of our young people as workers, as leaders, as politicians, as doctors, as scientists.
Yeah. No, and again, that when you look at the diversity of the country now, you know, and you look at that young person, we have to make opportunity out of diversity. And the way we make opportunity out of diversity is making sure everybody has access to education.
You know, the labor unions and labor movement have been key in promoting the rights of workers in the workplace, from banning child labor to the 5-day work week to the 40-hour work week. So could you just explain to our audience, for those who don't know, what is the function and purpose of a union? How does it operate? If a guy is thinking about joining a union, what should he expect or she expect?
Okay, you know, it's a good question. And again, this might sound a little rough, but when I talk to high school kids, I start with one question. I say, tell me the form of government in the United States. And they look at me like, come on, don't you know what that is? And eventually one will say, democracy. Then I'll say, now tell me the form of government at the place you work. And then they all have to stop and think. And eventually one will say, well, it's a monarchy. I said, monarchy? Because one person has more power in the workplace, and that's the business owner, and operator. But as Americans, we all say, one person, one vote, we should be equal.
Mm-hmm.
But are we equal when we go to work?
Okay.
No. Somebody tells us when to be there, what to do, what to wear. You know, we're exchanging our labor, our sweat, our intelligence for payment
Mm-hmm.
so that we can live and survive in this society. So I think that at a large philosophical level, a labor union is that injection of democracy into the workplace. A union is basically a democratic group of workers. They come together, not Democrat with a D like a political party, but Democrat with a small d. People coming together as workers, electing leaders, sitting down and talking about their workplace. Are there issues, are there concerns, are there things where people aren't feel they're treated fairly? And then sitting down with their employer through a process of collective bargaining. Let's sit down and negotiate. Let's talk. And let's see what we can do. And oftentimes, issues will arise that the employer may not even be aware of, which may seem like, oh, I didn't know that was going on in my workplace, but we'll settle those things and we'll talk it through and we'll come up with a contract. We'll come up with an agreement. This is how we're going to operate. And then that union elects its leadership. The members vote on that contract. So it doesn't matter if you're a construction worker, if you're a factory worker, if you're a retail worker, if you're a government worker, you have a right in this country to organize yourself. And you have a right to sit down with your fellow workers, build your own organization, and sit down and talk to your employer and have legal rights to talk to your employer. And I think the big challenge is oftentimes if I'm an individual and I've got a complaint, if I speak up, I'm a troublemaker. You know, and I may get fired, I may be dismissed, I may not get as many hours of work, I may get the bad shift. But if we come together as a group, then they can't just single one person out, because then the employer has to talk to the group and respect the group. And so at its basic level, it's democracy. It's what this country's all about. It's workers coming together, having a voice, having a say, and doing it to achieve some level of equality in the workplace.
So you're drawing a distinction between political democracy, where we go to the poll and vote for our leaders and their government and our policies, and you contrast that with economic democracy, which is democracy in the workplace.
Exactly.
Well, that sounds like a great idea. Well, how come there's so few unions?
Yeah. You know, and it's fascinating, you know, this is something that's part of United States law, and it's there, and I guess I would look at why there are so few at two things. Our labor law in this country is not very vigorous. And so if workers want a union and they try to organize, there are multiple ways for an employer to discourage that activity. And I think that makes it very difficult. And if a company is found in violation of labor law and not giving people their full rights, the fines or the consequences of that are not very, very powerful. So in some cases, workers get together, workers try to organize. Unions win a majority of elections when the National Labor Relations Board comes in and holds an election with a group of workers, but only in about 50% of those cases is a contract achieved. So there's a lot of things that get in the way of that. And I think the other obstacle, and maybe labor has to look in the mirror and improve itself in the process too, labor got a very bad stereotype in the 1950s, 60s, 70s as basically this group that's kind of detrimental business, strong-arming business, being greedy.
Like the Teamsters union.
Yeah, and the Teamsters were an example where that union got labeled because of some things that national leadership did. At the same time, you ask the average Teamster, I was living a pretty good life because that union, my union, was able to win some good contracts for me in that process. So I think politically labor has been segmented and stereotyped, and I think part of our effort as union members is to go out and say, look, no matter your workplace, no matter your race, no matter your gender, you've got a home here. And right now, statistically, majority of union members in this country are female. But the stereotype of a union member is a big, bulky guy
Yes.
who may not be too bright and and gets all this money and doesn't produce.
Right.
And I know a number of our unions, my union in particular, the laborers union, we've been very strong on labor management cooperation programs where we say to the employer, look, you're giving us a good wage, we got good benefits. Our job is to then be productive, trained workers that can come in and make you money.
Mm-hmm.
So not only do you prosper, we prosper together. And I think that's part of the equation. Is a prospering working class is going to be good for the business, and a labor movement has to realize, our part of our movement has to realize we've got a responsibility too, and our responsibility is that old adage of a fair day's work for a fair day's pay.
Mm-hmm. When you say the majority of labor union members are women now, that's
Yeah.
because of the service organizations, the maids, the cooks, or
That, and think of teachers, nurses,
Mhm.
And just the number of women that have come into traditionally male-dominated occupations. But you look at, particularly government workers have been a growth area for unions over the last 10 years, and a lot of women work for government. So statistically, if you mix it all together, it may not be true in Decatur or Peoria or Bloomington, but nationally, women are now the majority group
right.
in the labor movement.
Mm-hmm. The image of the union as a thug organization is still there. It's
Yeah.
almost like when people talk about Chicago, they still talk about Al Capone.
Right.
What is the union doing to change its face to the public?
Okay. I think one of the most important things is, and this is hard sometimes the best face for the union isn't always the business manager, the union president. Sometimes when we present ourselves to the public, we have to present the diversity of the membership that's out there. I think that's very critical. And I think part of it too is making sure we frame our message that it's not just, hey, I need more pay or I want more pay. How does improving conditions for a group of workers improve the community and improve opportunities for other workers too? If a union is strong in a town, an employer who does not want unions may have to say, I'm going to have to up my pay and benefits so that my workforce gets a comparable wage and benefits to the union worker.
Yes.
And when labor unions were a greater percentage of the economic workforce in the country, you saw wages go up for union and non-union alike. Right now, nationally, Bureau of Labor Statistics, the differential in a week's pay between a union worker and a non-union worker is $200 a week. That's a pretty significant amount of money.
Right.
But it's 2013 numbers, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics released 2 weeks ago that here's average union wages was $972 a week, $792 a week was the non-union wage.
Sure.
So that, if you frame it that way, it doesn't mean everybody's going to get $200 more a week, but joining a union
Yes.
can certainly help your pocketbook, and it can be done in a way that's not detrimental to the company, but in a way that can be a partnership. And for an employer, if I've got a union contract and I got decent conditions, I'm not going to run away from that. And one thing I hear frequently from employers is, I need stability. I need people who are going to show up every day. I need folks who are going to be here. I don't need to retrain my workforce constantly. So in a sense, a union contract can be a way to bring some stability to the workforce, folks that are going to be there ready to go to work every day because they know they've got some decent benefits and conditions with this employer.
There's a lot of manipulative myths out there, and one of them is that unions are a drag on business. And yet, my understanding is that the height of the labor movement, 35% of members were organized,
Right.
and the United States economy was at its peak at that time. And now we have the lowest union membership, and you know where our economy is.
Yeah,
So
and again, a good way to look at it is our economy for the last 30 years has enriched the 1%. And you can say, well, those people are supposed to then spend their money to trickle down to the rest of us. And I guess the question is, if our economic wealth is going to the top, how many yachts can you buy? How many mansions can you build? But if our economic production is shared, with the vast majority of people, those people are going to buy groceries, they're going to buy cars, they're going to buy trucks, they're going to buy a home,
Yeah.
they're going to take a vacation. Spreading that money out, that income out, as happens when we have a strong labor movement, then in a sense becomes a strong business climate too, because people have money to spend.
Sure.
And that money at the top tends to go into investments and bank accounts, whereas money at the middle goes out
So-
into the economy.
They spend every nickel of it.
Yeah.
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 If viewers watching tonight's program is
Uh-huh.
interested in saying, you know, I'd like to have my workplace organized.
Uh-huh.
I'd like to know about how I could get a union here. What should they do?
You know, I think, and again, this maybe call this consumer choice, but I think it's worthwhile to look around your community and say, what unions are active out there? You know, who's out there in my community that's active and involved? And talk to some of those organizations and see what they may be willing to bring to you, to the worker, in terms of resources. And it's also good to look at the industry. You know, if you're a construction worker, if you're in the service industry, if your employer is not just a Decatur employer, but a regional or national or multinational employer, what union already has a bargaining relationship with that employer, so that if I join that union, then in a sense I can come into a regional or a national contract and they've already got a bargaining history. So, but it doesn't hurt for the worker to shop around, and most unions these days will respect if they have a historic trade or field, they'll go into that, but many unions today will, if you're unorganized and nobody's out there talking to you, they'll spend some time with you. Again, just as a laborer, people, you know, we're construction laborers, we also represent all the medical personnel at Indian Health Services at every Indian reservation in the country, because they came looking for somebody, and they came to the laborers, and we organize them. And that's going to be true. Almost every union can say, well, here's our union title, but here's another group out here we've organized because workers were interested.
Do I understand that the AFL-CIO has a general membership available to people who are not union members?
Well, they do have, it's called Working Families.
Working families?
Yeah, and again, workingfamilies.org is how you'd find it on the internet.
Uh-huh.
And it's just, what it is a very good way to just keep informed on issues. And they send out regular emails. They have a good website with just, here's some issues, here's some economic things. And you look at campaigns that are going on right now to raise the minimum wage, to do more for fast food and retail workers, like Walmart workers, their national campaigns. Those are funded by unions. You know, that's those workers are speaking up for themselves, but labor is supporting them, even though these workers may not directly be members of a union.
I understand the workers in Seattle just had a big victory over the $15 an hour wage that was bought in by business and labor.
Yeah, no, and it's fascinating in Seattle because, again, it's not an economically depressed city, it's a booming city, and folks out there are saying, if we're going to have an economy, everybody has to participate.
Okay.
And particularly in a city like Seattle, you'll find that rent or housing isn't inexpensive. So if people are going to be economic participants, they need a little bit more just to be able to have the basic necessities of life. And I think that's the key thing with minimum wage. There was a time period in this country where minimum wage was above the poverty line. You know, and that to me is an incentive to work. And to keep the minimum wage below the poverty line when a huge majority of minimum wage workers are, I was looking at the statistics today, I think the average age for a minimum wage worker is 35. You know, that's not a teenager.
Right, I see.
That's somebody trying to support a family on minimum wage. And that means you and I, the taxpayer, we're paying for medical assistance, we're paying for food stamps. In a sense, we're subsidizing that employer to keep that person in that workplace.
That's not fully explained as we discuss that policy issue, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other piece of that is, in a sense, if you want lower taxes, quit subsidizing low-wage work for corporations that don't pay a living wage.
But at $15 an hour, isn't that an impediment or a drag on some local businesses like in Seattle?
You know, I think again, that you could probably find specific examples where it may be difficult. I think a lot of people would say that $15 an hour means more money's going to turn around.
How's that?
Well, because more people have more change
Okay.
in their pocket,
Mhm.
and they're going to come out and invest and spend money in our community.
Well, our time is almost
Yeah.
up, Mike. Thank you very much
Oh,
for
my
covering this. It's
pleasure.
been a fascinating
Sure.
discussion about the background behind the issues that confront our community.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.